I will now call to order the September 25, 2024 Clackamas County Board of Commissioners Land Use Hearing. Please stand for the Pledge of Allegiance. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Good morning, everyone. We are holding this meeting in person and virtually. Today, we will consider an application by Mr. James Kenny for a proposed comprehensive plan map amendment and zone change. No development is proposed with this application. Public testimony will be taken. As always, the public is welcome to sign up to testify. Those wishing to testify will be called on to provide testimony at the appropriate time. When you are called on, please be sure to include your name and the area where you live. I would like to remind all participants, including staff and public officials and members of the public, that Robert's Rules of Order will be followed in this meeting. We welcome your opinions and look forward to your polite participation. Assisting us in this hearing today is Principal Planner Martha Fritzie and our Clerk to the Board, Andrew Jarocki, and County Counsel Caleb Hugel. The hearing will proceed as follows. First, we will hear a presentation from Principal Planner Martha Fritzie. Then I will open a public hearing for testimony, beginning with the applicant, who may present if they wish. Next, a representative from the Planning Commission will have 3 minutes. Next, any public officials who wish to testify will have 3 minutes. Next, representatives from recognized community planning organizations and agencies will have 3 minutes. Finally, others wishing to testify will have 3 minutes. The board will then deliberate and either render a decision today or set a time to make a decision at a later date. Commissioners, we have quite the script in front of us as provided by County Counsel, and that's what will follow today. We will now begin the hearing on file numbers Z0197-24-ZAP and Z0198-24-CP with a legal statement by Caleb Hugel, followed by the planning staff's presentation of their report and recommendation. County Counsel Caleb Hugel, you are up. Thank you.
This is a quasi-judicial land use hearing, which means several important things for those participating. First, the applicable substantive criteria are listed in the staff report. Testimony, arguments, and evidence must be directed toward either those criteria or other criteria that the person believes apply to the decision. Second, failure to raise an issue accompanied by statements or evidence sufficient to afford the county and other parties an opportunity to respond precludes appeal to the Land Use Board of Appeals based on that issue. In addition, the failure of the applicant to raise constitutional or other issues related to proposed conditions of approval with sufficient specificity to allow the county to respond precludes an action for damages in circuit court on those issues. Once final, the decision on this application may be appealed to the Land Use Board of Appeals. At this time, I will ask the commissioners to disclose any ex parte contacts, bias, or conflicts of interest. Please indicate the nature and extent of the ex parte contact, bias, or conflict of interest, and indicate whether you intend to participate in or abstain from the hearing. If anyone wishes to challenge the impartiality of any commissioner, please clearly indicate your intention to do so in any testimony you provide.
None?
No conflict.
No. No.
Please proceed.
Go ahead. I will now open the public testimony on this item, and we'll begin with the applicant.
We skipped the presentation.
I'm sorry, Martha, you're up.
That's quite all right.
Totally jumped the gun.
That's okay. Good morning. I'm Martha Fritzie, Principal Planner with the county's Planning Division, and I am going to just sort of walk through the proposal and hopefully get through it fairly quickly. There are a few complicated or potentially complicated nuances that I'm going to try to explain briefly. I am happy to answer any questions if you feel like it wasn't explained in my attempt to get through this fast. So, as was noted, this is a hearing to discuss a proposed comprehensive plan map amendment and zone change. And specifically, the proposal is to change the comprehensive plan map designation from unincorporated community residential to rural commercial, with a corresponding zone change from RA1, rural area residential, to, oh, no, what happened? I'm sorry, to rural commercial. This would affect approximately 1 acre of the subject property. The comp plan zone change itself would not authorize any specific development. Any future development that's proposed would have to go through additional land use approvals in the form of design review. So the subject site is on the south side of Highway 212. It's a single tax lot. The total property is about 3.8 acres. As I noted, only about 1 acre is proposed for rezoning. The site itself, you can see here, has a fair amount of development on it already. It's relatively flat. Currently, there are 2 single-family homes on this property and a number of accessory and storage structures. There is a habitat conservation area overlay on a portion of this property, but there are no other overlays. And you can see in the yellow here, the habitat conservation area overlay, sort of along the southeastern portion of the property. Most of the development that exists currently is outside of this area. The specific acre that is proposed for rezoning is identified here on the left. It's sort of in the northwest corner of the property, and we'll talk a little bit more about that at the very that area at the very end of this presentation. So the site itself is within the unincorporated community of Boring. Unincorporated communities are small, sort of historically established settlements outside of urban growth boundaries. It's not a city, but it is its own entity that was established under state law and adopted into our comprehensive plan that essentially recognizes these small communities, small rural communities that existed prior to the land use rules that exist now. And so this is in the community of Boring. This, interestingly, is also within an urban reserve for the Portland Metropolitan Urban Growth Boundary. That is relevant when we get down to some of the criteria for this zone change, and I'll talk a little bit more about that. The zoning that surrounds this property within the unincorporated community of Boring is very mixed. Immediately west of the site is pink, in the hot pink is other rural commercial. The sort of purplish is rural industrial, and then all the yellows are other residential zones. And so it's pretty mixed. There's a number of commercial businesses along Highway 212 across the street, roughly across the street from this subject property is the fire station. There's a number of other businesses, including a bank, a post office. So this area is really already a fairly developed community. So moving on to process. Notice of this application was provided as per state law in our zoning code back in July of this year. We've received very few comments. They have generally been limited to comments from ODOT because, as we are all aware, Highway 212 is an ODOT road, and county engineering, discussing the applicant's traffic study, and the comments provided by those 2 agencies are found in Exhibits 4 through 7 in your packet, and we'll talk again a little bit more about those in a minute. The local community planning organization is the Boring CPO. The Boring CPO was given notice but didn't provide any specific testimony, although the applicant did provide a letter in his application from the Boring CPO that indicated that he had come and talked to the CPO and that the CPO was in support of this. This is much earlier in this year. So, per usual, there are a whole number of relevant policies and criteria. I am not going to go through every single one of these. They are described in detail with findings in the Planning Commission staff report that's included in your packet. I'm going to sort of hit the high levels here, and again, I'm available for additional questions if you need more detail. So I'm really going to focus on how these all relate to the 4 main criteria for zone changes. And the first one being that the proposed zone change is consistent with the applicable goals and policies of the county's comprehensive plan. This is sort of where we find the meat of, what what zone and what comp plan designation can be applied in what area. And so generally speaking, the applicant has to go through the comprehensive plan and identify which goals and policies are applicable, and so does staff. And in this case, we found policies in chapters 2 and 11 of our comprehensive plan. Those are largely procedural and coordination, and those have all been met through the procedures for this application. Chapter 5 is our transportation system plan. It identifies that a zone change must comply with the state's transportation planning rule. State law also requires that. And then Chapter 4 is our land use policies, and that's really where a lot of the policies specific to zoning designations are found. In this case, a rural commercial designation, the Chapter 4 identifies where you can apply a rural commercial designation. There's really two choices. One is if you have an historic commitment to a commercial use, which this property clearly does not. The other one is if you are in an unincorporated community, which this property is, and have direct access to a road of collector, I think, classification or higher, which this clearly is. And so it's pretty clear that it meets our rural commercial policies. Interestingly, there's also some policies about allowing new uses in urban reserves. Historically, it was our understanding that you could not do zone changes in urban reserves at all. There has been some new understanding and new read of state law. There are actually exceptions in state law that will allow for us, in some cases, to do zone changes or allow new uses in reserves. It's discussed in detail in the Planning Commission findings. The short version is that we have found that this property can meet those exceptions if we apply a 1 acre minimum lot size, because that's the current minimum lot size in the RA1 zone. And so that will be one of the recommended conditions of approval. So that's one of the bigger ones. The second criteria really has to do with a demonstration that any public services that would be needed are available. That is fairly straightforward. That's done through statements of feasibility from the applicable service providers. In this case, it's the water provider and the engineering division that looks at stormwater management. This property is not within a sewer district. Any development has to be on septic or on-site wastewater systems. And then the last two big criteria have to do with the transportation system. The first one, that being the transportation system is adequate. In other words, it meets the transportation planning rule. The second one is that the safety of the transportation system is adequate. And so a traffic study is always submitted by an applicant for a zone change. And in this case, the traffic study concluded after the analysis that this zone change probably would have a significant effect on the adequacy of the transportation system if it was just allowed sort of unfettered. That's probably not the right word. But if there were some limitations put on this zone change in the form of a trip cap, then it would be able to meet this standard and the system would remain adequate. And so state law allows for this. And in this case, the recommended trip cap was 400 average daily trips. And what that means is, under the rural commercial zone, in theory, any use allowed in the zoning code would be allowed on this property. However, the size and scale of that use will be limited by the expected traffic generation of that use. And that's calculated using standards and found, and I'm not a traffic engineer, so I'm going to muddle through this a little bit, but it's calculated generally using a trip generation manual that is standard in the industry. So for example, if you have somebody coming in to do a specific retail business, they would look at the manual and say, oh, a 2,000 square foot retail business of this type generates on average 350 daily trips, and so yes, you could do that. Or if they look at it and say, no, this on average generates 1,000 daily trips, you'd say, no, we can't do that, it doesn't meet our trip cap. So that's sort of what that means, and that was a recommended condition of approval. The traffic study also found that the proposal would not have a significant effect on the safety of the system. And so staff had found that this proposal meets all the applicable criteria for a comp plan map amendment and zone change to rural commercial if certain conditions are put on it. So the Planning Commission had a hearing on August 26th, and one neighbor testified, not necessarily in opposition. The neighbor more had some questions about road improvements and implications for their property. At the Planning Commission hearing, though, there were two significant issues that came up and were discussed by the planning commissioners. One of them is this trip cap. And the analysis in the traffic study about left turn lane warrants and whether or not the trip cap was appropriate. And so I tried to outline some of this discussion in your summary that you received. And essentially, the Planning Commission was concerned because of the traffic studies safety analysis that looked at whether or not a left turn lane may be required, and at the end of the day, they recommended the trip cap be reduced to 200 from 400. The second issue that came up for discussion was this habitat conservation overlay that's on the property. There were a couple of commissioners concerned about potential future impacts of development on that area, and I think that while that is a legitimate concern, there's no particular criteria related to the habitat conservation area that directly apply to the zone change. And the fact of the matter is this property already can be divided into 3 lots, and nothing under the current zoning, and nothing about this zone change would change that ability. And so it's really hard to say that this would somehow create a greater impact on the habitat conservation area. The rules in our zoning code that relate to the habitat conservation area will apply regardless of whatever zoning this is. And so ultimately, the Planning Commission recommended approval of these files as conditioned, except they made 2 amendments. One is they were recommending reducing the trip cap to 200 average daily trips. And the other one really had to do with the site plan that was provided. Staff had identified some concerns with the site plan and was requesting a revision because the line was going right through a building, the zoning line, and there was a few other things. The Planning Commission were also very concerned about where the septic systems were in relation to this line and wanted to ensure that the zoning line didn't go through the septic system. So those were the 2 changes that were recommended. The vote was 6-3 to recommend approval with these changes. The votes in opposition were really for 2 main reasons. One was one of the commissioners didn't want to reduce the trip cap, so it wasn't that they were necessarily opposed to the zone change. And the other one was these stated concerns about the habitat conservation area, and they were just unsure about whether or not it would create greater impacts. So since the Planning Commission hearing, the applicant has provided a revised site plan as requested. It does identify where the septic systems are and that the proposed line is not going through those septic systems. It does identify a line going through a portion of a storage building, which they have noted is going to be removed, and it shows that the remaining buildings will meet property line setbacks in case of a future land division. And so these are all the things that we had asked for. And so that takes care of a lot of staff's concerns and the Planning Commission's concerns. I guess one thing that you will see in the recommended conditions of approval is that prior to actual adoption of this, should you approve it, we would like to, planning would like to require that the applicant actually remove that portion of the building before we actually adopt. So if you were to approve it today, they would have to demonstrate that that portion of the building has been demoed before we would come to you for the formal adoption for the zone change, because the zone change is effective immediately upon your adoption. So that was a lot. Staff's recommendation is also approval. And with conditions, in the case of the trip cap, based on some additional information that was provided in Exhibit 7 or 8, I'm not sure which one, from county engineering, staff finds that the 400 average daily trip cap is more defensible under state law because it is something that is specifically called out as a, for lack of a better term, safe harbor in the transportation planning rule. And that's something that our traffic engineers have concluded as well. So we would recommend the trip cap stay at 400. Again, the minimum lot size would have to be 1 acre in order to meet some of the state law requirements. And then this idea that the portion of the structure that the zoning boundary line is going through on the site plan be removed prior to adoption. And that's it.
Great. I'm sure we have questions. Commissioners. Commissioner Shull, go ahead.
Yes, thank you very much for that information. I don't see this zone change as a problem. It's adjoining existing rural commercial. I also was pleased to hear your recommendation that the trip cap be at 400, because reducing it, I think, would limit potential commerce on it. So I see this as a benefit to commerce and Boring, and I support the 400 trip cap. I support the zone change to rural commercial, and also concur with the demo requirement before this is completed. Thank you.
Thank you, Commissioner Shull. Commissioner Savas.
Yeah, I want to hear more, maybe from after testimony or during testimony regarding the trip cap piece, but I do have one basic question, and maybe we can wait for that later on timing-wise, and that would be, should the highway be developed, widened or whatnot, and a turn lane be put in the future, would the trip cap still apply?
Yes, it would. It would still apply because it would be a condition of the approval, and it's really related to the adequacy, the analysis of the adequacy of the transportation system, which talks about, looks a lot more at intersections and volume, I believe, whatever the standard, the performance standards are for intersections. If at some point in time the highway were developed and was operating so well that the property owner thought, well, maybe I could do another traffic study and apply for an amendment to that condition, they could actually come in and apply for a modification, but it wouldn't just automatically disappear.
Okay. Last question, are there any other of these properties that have a trip cap less than 400?
Within the community of Boring, are you asking?
Yeah.
Not that I am aware of. I know there are other properties in the county where we have done zone changes and put trip caps on them. It's not common, but it's certainly done, and we can do it.
And I just thought of one more question, that is, there's nothing that forecloses any other adjacent property or nearby property in similar context to apply for a similar zone change. So
Right.
a neighboring property could do that, and they would be subject to the trip cap as well, or a trip cap discussion as well.
A trip cap discussion, yes, whatever their traffic study says.
Okay.
But it's likely to be the same discussion.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Commissioners. We'll have more opportunities to opine, and you may ask the people testifying questions as well as they come forward. I will now open the public testimony on this item, beginning with the applicant. Does the applicant wish to testify, excuse me? Of course you applied. Come on up. Please state your name, your area of residence.
Would you like my actual resident?
Sure.
It's James Kinney, 28712 Southeast Highway 212, Boring, Oregon. And I would like to add that that's actually a carport that the line would be going through, so it's not actually a building. So it's 15-foot wide carport that actually stops right at that line, so I can make any adjustments that's required. So that's all.
Good. Any questions for the applicant? Do you have anybody else online or in the room who wants to testify on your behalf?
I don't believe so at this time.
Now would be the time. And what is your opinion of the trip cap? Recommended from the Planning Commission, and yet staff has asked to modify that?
I would like to keep it at 400. I do live next door, and I want to make sure it's a nice, calm location that's, there's not a lot of traffic and stuff like there, and I don't want to be limited on possibly making money or, having this go south because I have to, not allow people to come in, close the gate early or whatever.
Okay.
So I'd
Got
like to
it.
keep it at, the required amount.
Okay, thank you. Thank you for coming.
Thank you.
Are there any public officials in the room who would like to testify? Seeing none. Andrew, are there any public officials on Zoom who would like to testify?
If you are a public official attending on Zoom, I'll now ask you to raise your hand, and I'll call on you to speak. Chair, I see none.
Thank you. Are there any CPOs or agencies in the room who would like to testify on this particular hearing? See none. Andrew, is there any CPO or agency online who would like to testify?
If you are a representative of a CPO or agency attending on Zoom, I'll now ask you to raise your hand, and I'll call on you to speak. I see none, Chair.
Thank you. We will now hear testimony from the public. Is there anyone in the room who would like to testify on this hearing? Seeing none. Andrew, is there anyone from the public online who would like to testify?
If you are a member of the public and wish to testify and you are attending on Zoom, I'll now ask you to raise your hand, and I'll call on you to speak. I see none, Madam Chair.
Thank you very much. Can I close the public hearing, or no? You want to opine?
Madam Chair, I believe the Planning Commission Chair is online and would like to testify in this application.
Thank you. Would you please bring on the Planning Commission Chair?
Mr. Peterson, you now have the ability to speak.
Oh, hi, good morning. Thank you for the opportunity. I guess in light of what I just heard, I think the kind of the big issue really centers around what was behind the Planning Commission's cap. And to be honest, it was really came about as a result of one of our newest commissioners who happens to be a civil engineer, traffic engineer, and was concerned about the safety and that he felt that ODOT was recommendation was kind of a standard recommendation that it may be deemed a little further study, and in his mind felt that was a little bit too high. So the rest of us, or not the rest of us, but a majority of us felt like, okay, that seemed like a reasonable requirement for the application, and that's why we voted for that. Other than that, I think Martha did a pretty good job of sharing what the other issues were with the Planning Commission.
Thank you. Thank you, Tom Peterson, for testifying today on this and explaining why. Anyone else would like to testify online or in the room before I close out the public hearing? And now we will continue. Do commissioners have questions or comments that you would like to express and/or ask for more information? Commissioner Scholl?
Yeah, Chair Smith, I'm comfortable with this zone change. I'm also comfortable, I do, with the trip cap kept at 400. I do respect and appreciate the Planning Commission, their recommendation, but in this case, I prefer to hold it at 400. Thank you.
Thank
And I
you.
can make a motion anytime you like.
Okay, we'll go to you for a motion. Commissioner Savas, you're up.
Yeah, I would like to see, just thinking ahead, what could possibly happen if a neighboring property chose to do this and go through this exercise. maybe they had a similar kind of traffic study findings similarly, but perhaps the owner, the applicant, potentially would want to have or see, have a very strong opinion about the trip cap being closer to the engineered recommended level. And if there was potentially a variance of that, let's just say 200, if we were to approve 200, and someone was seeking or had a trip count estimate of maybe 300 in the future, that those inconsistencies without justification might complicate future decisions. So I would like to see consistency and also have something defensible. So I guess my question to Martha is there a finite mathematical reason why it landed on 200, not 210, not 250? Or is it the standard that is perhaps more defensible of 400? I'm not asking for your opinion per se, just more the technical basis of that number of 200.
Right. So the Planning Commission arrived at 200 not based on any specific mathematical analysis. What it was based on was an analysis that was done in the traffic study related to left turn lane warrants, which my understanding of is that it's an analysis that looks at a threshold at which point a left turn lane, sort of a pocket left turn lane, might be considered because of the traffic volumes that would be turning left. So the analysis for the left turn lane warrants in the traffic study used a number of 180 average daily trips because that is what a drive-through coffee kiosk, they call it, would generate, and that is what the applicant has indicated they desired to do. There was no additional study done up to the 400 average daily count. And so the Planning Commission was concerned that because the analysis said, well, it was getting close to, meeting a left turn lane warrant, at which point they might consider doing something. They said, well, since we don't know, we think 200 is a good number. And so that's how the 200 came about. I mean, it wasn't totally without basis, but it also wasn't based on any specific numerical analysis. The 400 is actually a sort of safe harbor that's found in state law in the transportation planning rule. If you are not generating more than 400 average daily trips, you can sort of safe harbor by default say, yes, we meet the transportation planning rule. We are not going to create more trips than this, and therefore, we don't need to do any additional analysis on the adequacy of the system. Does that make sense?
Okay, it does.
Okay.
Though I know it's complicated.
Right, and I guess I'll throw out there also that the county's traffic engineer who reviewed this and submitted comments is in the audience today if you have specific questions for him. If I muddled through it and said something inaccurate, please jump up.
So, as I think I heard earlier, that the traffic engineer's recommendation is the 400 trip cap.
Yes.
That's correct, okay. Now, as I mentioned earlier, I think my concern is about consistency and also potential future developments or applicants with a similar type of business that we don't have I won't say a hodgepodge, but we have, has set a standard or a precedent, if you will, that it could vary. So I'm not comfortable with that if it's not 100% mathematically or technically defensible. And in this case, I totally respect and appreciate all the hard work our Planning Commission did on this. And it sounds like the recommendation with tearing down the carport and so forth will be followed. On this one particular aspect with regard to the cap, I'm probably going to lean more towards the engineering recommendation of 400.
Thank you, Commissioner Savas. I too had questions regarding the traffic, and I think when I looked at the map, one of the first questions I asked staff with Martha, well, what about a left turn lane in there? Now, Martha, did you tell me that we're just dealing with the land use approval here today on the zone change? We are not making decisions on the traffic, and that will come later. Is that right? Although we have a trip cap that we're considering today, we are not telling ODOT, oh, gee, you must put in a left turn lane. Is that later in additional planning process?
Right, so there is a traffic analysis involved in the zone change, but when actual development is proposed, they will have to go through an additional review. We look at traffic. ODOT has already discussed with the property owner that there will be certain requirements, including, I believe, a sidewalk they'd have to build. I mean, so there are additional requirements that will happen at the time of development.
Right. So I owned a property very similar to this on an ODOT property in Malala, and ingress and egress was an issue. And it wasn't until I was very much later into the development phase that I had to perform a lot of improvements on sidewalk, on site view, that although the city of Malala approved for me, they didn't tell me it was coming. And so that was many thousands of dollars that I was not prepared to do. So I'm hoping the applicant knows that just because we're at this phase, that there could be more to come. You know, I appreciate that this is on a highway, and safety needs to be a concern. That is a busy road. But, you know, I also appreciate that the applicant wants to start a business in Clackamas County. I just think that's magnanimous, especially in these troubling times of uncertainty in our economics. You know, he believes in Clackamas County. He believes in the process enough, and he believes in commerce to go ahead on this. And I'm very supportive of the 400 daily cap, just in mind that's more to come for the applicant. Any other questions or comments from commissioners?
No, just, I think it's evident now that this, as these processes are, I will just use the word incremental, this is a zone change. It's not an application for the actual activity of the business. So,
Yeah.
you know, so we're within the confines and the process of a zone change and not application for an operational business or so forth. So
Yep.
appreciate that distinction or recognition, that is.
Yep. And two, you know, I understand what you're talking about for the future. Gee, what happens if we have more development in the area? You know, I don't have a crystal ball. I don't know how we can quantify what might happen in the future or what might not happen in the future. The only thing that we can do, and I've often said this on many issues, we make a decision based on the facts that are presented today, on what's happening today. And in the future, that's a different decision for somebody else on the line. Thank you for that, Paul. Commissioner Scholl, you said you wanted to make a motion.
I sure will. I move to approve comprehensive plan map amendment and zone change Z0197-24-ZAP and Z0198-24-CP with a trip cap at 400.
Is that correct?
Commissioner Scholl, would you mind rephrasing your motion as either the recommended motion or one of the alternative motions on your script?
Oh, I see. Thank you. I move to, we approve file numbers Z0197-24-ZAP and Z0198-24-CP as recommended by staff.
Clarification, as recommended by staff, and as I'm looking at the script here, so that would not be the planning commission recommendation, it would be the staff recommendation. Okay, I'll second that motion.
Okay. Commissioner Scholl has moved we approve file numbers Z0197-24-ZAP and Z0198-24CP as recommended by staff with the clarification, as Commissioner Savas said, of a 400 daily trip cap. Thank you very much, Commissioners. Any further discussion? Are we okay on the motion? All righty. Would the clerk please take the poll?
Commissioner Savas,
Aye.
Commissioner Scholl,
Aye.
Chair West.
Aye. Motion passes 3-0. Thank you very much, staff. Let me finish my script here. Now that the application has been approved, I will direct staff to draft an order reflecting this decision and include it on the agenda for this board's adoption at a future business meeting. Anything else? Okay. Thank you. I was a little rough around the edges today. Had some distractions before I came in. Thank you, commissioners, for being patient with me. And seeing no further business before this board, we are adjourned.